You are standing at the precipice of both an incredibly dangerous moment in American history, but also an amazingly possible moment. When it's white folks in pain, we understand there are systemic causes. When it's black and brown folks in pain, we ignore the system and we focus on the individual and we blame them because we lack radical empathy.
You have to say Black Lives Matter rather than All Lives Matter because we said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We said all, but we didn't mean all.
The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling working class white people that their enemies are black and brown.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Speak Out with Tim Wise, a project of Speak Out, the nation's premier nonprofit speakers bureau, which for over 25 years has been bringing educators and activists to campuses and communities across America to engage in meaningful dialogue about the pressing issues that confront our country and the world. If you enjoy the program, one way you can express your support is to become a monthly patron and sustainer of the show by signing up at www.patreon.com/Speak Out with Tim Wise. You can pledge as little as $2 a month or as much as you'd like, and not only know that you're supporting our efforts, but also gain access to bonus content, like premium commentaries on the events of the week, as well as signed books or DVDs. And all donations are tax deductible as they go directly to Speak Out to support their nonprofit activist mission. You can also make a one-time donation to the program at speakoutnow.org via PayPal, and make sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's Speak Out with Tim Wise. In keeping with my summer schedule, whereby I really haven't been interviewing people, but instead have been doing special commentaries, extended discussions, or putting together previous commentaries that had been behind my patreon.com paywall, today will also be a little bit different. Today's presentation will be my plenary session speech at the American Psychological Association National Conference held on the 11th of August of this year in San Francisco. The talk, in which I discuss the psychological effects of the criminalization of blackness in America and over-policing of black communities, will explore the way in which inequalities in the justice system affect both the target of those inequalities, mostly people of color, and also how it affects the psychology of the dominant group, those of us who are white in America. Thank you so much. It is great to be here. This is a really huge conference, and so it's a really big honor to be a part of it. It's especially an honor to be a part of it considering that I'm not a psychologist. I have no psychology background. I did just start therapy, but I don't think that counts. It's only been like a month, so. And the fact that I just started therapy and I told a room full of psychologists and they laughed means I'm going to have to talk to my therapist about that. So thanks. Thought I had enough shit to deal with now. Come here and this too. Okay, all right. It's okay. No, it is really an honor to be here, and particularly to talk about this incredibly important subject. In the program and online, I know the topic of the talk is White Lives Matter, Race, Crime, and the Politics of Fear in America, which was supposed to be the name of a book that I was supposed to have finished about 8 months ago. I didn't, but I'm going to give the talk because I've got a lot of the material. I just haven't had the chance to get the book written, another subject for my therapist and I to talk about. But it is an important topic, and it is important to talk about it at this time in America, this notion of the connection between race and crime, particularly certain folks of certain racial and ethnic backgrounds, and crime and danger. It's a propitious time to talk about that because even though tomorrow, as you know, white nationalists and neo-Nazis affiliated with this thing called the alt-right are going to be amassing, I don't know how massive it'll be, but they're going to be gathering just outside the White House. I don't know what would lead them to believe that that would be a friendly spot to go, but apparently they have decided that that will be the site of their annual Unite the Right rally this year, unlike Charlottesville last year. They're going to be gathering, this is a group of people whose affiliates and followers have killed 43 people in the last 4 years. Not just Heather Heyer last year in Charlottesville. 43 dead bodies that we can put on the so-called alt-right, the white nationalist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, misogynist movement. 43 people they've killed in 4 years, 17 just last year, but apparently in this country we're still more afraid of Black Lives Matter protesters. And we're still more afraid of children and their families seeking asylum, right, as long as they're brown, at least. And we're still more afraid of black football players taking a knee in protest of police injustice and larger racism issues in the justice system, even though I beg to remind you that none of those ball players who are taking that knee have killed anybody, let alone 43 people. None of those Black Lives Matter protesters have killed anybody, let alone 43 people. None of those asylum-seeking children and their families have killed anybody, let alone 43 people. So whom we identify as dangerous, as criminal, pathological, deviant, and worthy of our fear is obviously not actually about who's the most dangerous, who's the most deviant, who's the most pathological, and who's the most fear-worthy. It has something to do with something else. It's also a propitious time here in the Bay Area to talk about this for a lot of reasons, particularly those who are from here know. But just yesterday, a video goes viral, interesting, fascinating video of a clinical psychologist in Oakland, white, one of y'all's now, you see, one of y'all's. Talking about clinical psychologists, not necessarily white people, though maybe it's one of ours too, who is on this viral video ranting at a couple of Latino men who had dared to park a car in front of her house. She comes out, and like all these other folks that have been calling the cops on some bullshit, and you know, Barbecue Becky over in Oakland also, and then Permit Patty here in San Francisco, and nice liberal Bay Area, right, white folks, right? See, black and brown people know it's not quite that real, but like white folks think this is heaven, right? White progressives and white liberals come to the Bay Area and they still think it's 1967 and the summer of love. Only it wasn't even that for black people in the Bay Area, but I guess it was for some hippies, and so everything's fine. See, the white liberals are nervous now. It's like, what? The black folks are like, oh shit, this is actually gonna get real, but So this white woman who's a clinical psychologist over in Oakland is trying to call the cops, threatening to call the cops because these two men have parked in front of her house. She identifies herself falsely as an immigration attorney because I guess she has some professional issue where she doesn't think it's enough to be a clinical psychologist. Maybe she needs to check in with somebody and figure out why that's not enough. But she claimed to be an immigration attorney so as to scare them. They said, well, it really doesn't matter. You can call the cops if you want. We are legal residents here in the country. She has quit her job apparently, or left her job at the clinic where she worked, so that's a good sign, I suppose. But again, the story itself says something, right? It says that even educated people, even people with quote-unquote good jobs, even people in nice progressive cities, right, have been trained and have internalized so many of these fears about black and brown bodies that when we see them out of place, right, whether that's law enforcement who thinks they're out of place or just average everyday citizens who do, right, we jump to conclusions about their pernicious motivations for being in that particular space, and then we take it upon ourselves to either police them and harass them or call actual law enforcement to do the job for us. So it's important for us to discuss this fear phenomenon, to discuss the psychological effects, as your program mentions, the psychological effects that this disproportionate policing, and when I use the term policing, I don't just mean official state-sanctioned policing, because when we even threaten to call the cops on people, we are acting in a policing kind of way, right? When we harass, when we cajole, when we follow around the store, at the mall, right? When we engage in our own form of racial or ethnic or religious profiling, all of which happen on a regular basis, that's a form of policing too. So I just want to be clear that we're not putting it all on the folks that actually have the badges and the guns. We're all capable of engaging in a certain kind of de facto policing. That's what George Zimmerman was doing after all, not actually a cop, not actually a security guard, just a wannabe who happened to have a gun and a short temper and decided it was a smart idea to take out after somebody because he suspected them of being up to no good. So we have to talk about why this happens and what the effects of it are. Before we can do that, we have to be really clear about the level of over-policing, though, especially on the official level. So even though I'm not just talking about that, I do want to make it clear, because there are some folks who apparently are still not clear on the extent to which black and brown communities are over-policed and are disproportionately victimized by things like police violence, law enforcement violence. So let's just get that out of the way. The data is consistent over time in virtually every study that you wish to consult, that black folks, for instance, are between 3 and 3.5 times more likely than white folks to be shot and killed by law enforcement, even when they are unarmed and posing no threat at the moment that the shooting takes place. This is not the result of simply saying, well, that's because the crime rates are higher in black communities, because that's the excuse that gets used. Well, the crime rate's higher, so of course the rate at which police kill them is going to be higher, but that's not really an accurate reflection of what's going on, because when you disaggregate the data down to the local level, you find that the numbers of black folks shot by police and the rates at which they are shot bears no statistically significant relationship to the area's crime rate, let alone the black crime rate. So if it was just about crime in general, or black crime in particular, we'd expect more of these police-involved shootings of black people to happen in the places with more crime and more black crime, and that's not how it goes down. So it isn't about that. It's about the fear and the anxiety that police, like all of us, have been exposed to, because we've all been exposed to those stereotypes, right? The idea that somehow police have escaped them, right, is no more logical than to think that we have escaped them. It's no more logical than to think that psychologists have escaped them, or that doctors and nurses have escaped them. Advertising works, and it works on everybody. That's why they keep doing it, right? You think about why companies take out ads, hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising just for the Super Bowl alone, right? Let alone everyday advertising. They do it because they know the more ads you see of their product, the more likely you are to buy it. There's this thing in marketing and advertising called the Rule of 12. And it says that after you've seen an ad for a commercial product like a dozen times, that's the point at which you are exponentially more likely to buy it. Right? The first couple times you see the ad, you don't even know what the hell the ad was about. You ever have that happen? You're like, what the hell was that? What are they trying to sell me? That's a stupid ad. I don't even know what the hell they're selling. You think they're stupid? They just spent millions of dollars to produce that ad. They're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. They know that the fifth time you see that ad, you're going to stop whatever you're doing just to pay closer attention so you can figure out what the hell it was they were trying to tell you the first time. Right? And then by the time you get to that 10th time you've seen the ad, you're starting to get real curious. And by the time you hit number 12, you're like, oh, Taco Bell breakfast crunch wrap, huh? None of y'all wanted that before they created it, right? It's just like none of y'all were calling up Taco Bell, writing letters, sending emails saying, you know what we need at 6 o'clock in the damn morning is a taco wrapped in a burrito with a piece of sausage and an egg in it. Make that happen, y'all. Nobody was asking for that. But some genius in the marketing department was like, watch this. Creates this product, generates demand. Now folks are lined up around the block, not satisfied with Egg McMuffins anymore, going down to Taco Bell to get breakfast crunch wraps that nobody needed or wanted. Why? Because advertising works. Well, if I can make you buy that after 12 ads, if I can make you change toothpaste, change toilet paper, if I can make you switch to my kind of smartphone versus the one you've been using for the last 5 or 6 years, all because you saw some ads, how much easier is it to convince you of racial and gender and class and religious stereotypes, because you've been seeing that ad all your life, and you've seen it a lot more than a dozen times, if you know what I mean. Metaphorically speaking, we've been conditioned by that kind of impulse and that kind of quote-unquote advertising all our lives, so police have fallen prey to it. Most of us have, to one extent or another, fallen prey to it. So let's just be clear. The over-policing and the violence committed by police and law enforcement against people of color is very clear. And then even short of violence and shooting of such persons, we know with policies like stop and frisk in New York, which the courts have rendered essentially inoperative. It still happens, but at a much different level than it used to, because the courts have ruled it unconstitutional. But that policy that was carried out for 14 or 15 years with wild abandon had nothing to do with fighting crime. 85% of the people who were stopped by New York police were people of color, but 94% of the time they didn't even end up getting a ticket that could be sustained in court for something like jaywalking, let alone weapons possession, let alone drugs. Only like 0.4% of the time did they have a weapon on them. Right? Only about 1.5% of the time did the folks who get stopped have any kind of drugs on them, and the white folks that were stopped were more likely to have drugs on us than the black folks who were stopped, but they kept stopping the black folks at rates that were 3 times, 4 times, 5 times higher, depending on the year. So this is what we mean by over-policing, and this is why folks of color don't trust cops. It's really not a mystery We keep acting like it's, why don't you, I was on CNN the other day with this guy who's former FBI agent, former cop, and he said the big problem is black people just don't show respect for authority. But how in the world are folks going to show and be expected to show respect for authority when it's authority that has been the tip of the spear of oppression for decades, for generations, and for hundreds of years? How in the world are we going to ask for respect from people who have never received it? Because black and brown folks know that the history of law enforcement has been the history of over-policing. Slave patrols were the first iteration of law enforcement in this country. Right? It was police who pulled those protesters off those stools in the South where I'm from. Cops did that. Not just good old boys in Klan costumes. They might have been good old boys who had Klan costumes, but they did it under cover of law. And black and brown folks remember that. 27 members of the Black Panther Party were killed by cops, not Klansmen, by cops, under cover of law. Again, they might have been Klansmen, but they did it in uniform, you see. So when people of color don't trust law enforcement, we can't look at that as some kind of deviant psychology or pathology. That's a very rational thing. It might seem irrational to fear certain people if you've never had that experience, right? But when black and brown folks engage in what they call furtive movements, that was actually used as a rationale for stop and frisk in New York City. Why are they engaged in furtive movements, which means trying to get away from cops, right? So like if I see you coming my way and I'm black and you're a cop, I turn around and go the other way. They were using that as a justification for stopping the person because apparently it's irrational for black people to fear police in spite of all the history that I just mentioned to you and the extemporaneous contemporary data that suggests that fear is quite rational. Now, we do have at least one court in this country, and I want to point this out and give some credit to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court. Recently, about a year ago, they actually ruled that fear of police on the part of black folks is so rational, it's not irrational, it is so rational that the cops in Massachusetts are now forbidden, at least in theory. I'm sure it's still happening, but in theory, they are not allowed to use running away from police as a reason to stop black people. That's actually quite a breakthrough. It's not a national thing, and I'm not sure that it's really even being followed in the state of Massachusetts. But at least we have a court that is willing to say that this thing that Jody David Armour, professor of law at USC, calls negrophobia is not rational, it's not okay, but the fear of law enforcement on the part of black folks is. See, we don't ratify black fear, we ratify the police officers' fear when they open fire on a person of color, don't we? We say, well, they were scared. Or we rationalize the fear of George Zimmerman, or we rationalize the fear of folks who claim stand your ground. Now, there was a study that came out just this last week which found that stand your ground laws, these are the things that allow you to blast somebody because you're afraid that they pose some kind of imminent danger to you. That in cases where the person who gets shot, right, and then there's a stand your ground claim, in cases where the person who gets shot is white, those claims of stand your ground are twice as likely to fail and that person's twice as likely to be convicted. But if the person who shot is black, those claims tend to be upheld because the fear is seen as rational. This is how this thing that Armour calls negrophobia gets enshrined in law, right? So this is obviously, and it's also been enshrined in the civil courts, interestingly. There's a case that Jody David Armour talks about in his book by that name, Negrophobia, which was written in the mid-90s, but is every bit as relevant today as it was then, where he talks about a woman who actually filed a claim in court for disability on the basis of her fear of black people making it impossible for her to go back to work. And the reason was she had been mugged outside her place of employment by someone who happened to be black. She files a disability claim, permanent disability claims. She ain't saying she can never go back to work, not just there, anywhere, ever again, because she might have to come in contact with black people. And do you know that the courts actually granted her permanent disability on that basis, in effect ratifying negrophobia as a legitimate claim in civil courts in this country? So this is an ongoing problem, and it's a problem which we've actually legitimized, right? This fear of the black and brown body. What do we think the effects of that would be? And again, as not a psychologist, I'm not in a position to necessarily act as a clinician here. I certainly can't do that, but some of this is pretty easy to discern, isn't it? On the one hand, this constant over-policing, this constant fear, and the recognition on the part of black and brown folks that they are feared and suspected first, and presumed guilty in so many cases rather than innocent. is going to heighten the anxiety response of such people and the people in those communities. Levels of anxiety are going to be through the roof, again, worrying and then engaging in those furtive movements, running away from officers, which then in many states and all around the country serves as a rationalization for pursuit, a rationalization for shooting. Just this last week in Nashville, where I live, you may have seen the video that's circulating online. A young man was shot in the back as he ran away from an officer. Right? And the officer said, well, he had a gun. They found a gun at the scene, and they suggested or implied that this black man had turned and pointed the gun at the officer. But now we have video footage from a school across the street from where the shooting happened that this young man was 40 feet in front of the officer, running away from him, never turned around. No evidence of a gun in the video, though admittedly it's from a distance, and so we can't be 100% sure, but we certainly can see that he didn't turn, he didn't point it, he posed no threat to the officer. The officer shoots him 4 times in the back and in the head, and he's dead today. Because he was running, and because people will then rationalize that and say, well, why was he running? And white folks will say that because to us, see, being afraid of cops like that just doesn't make sense to us. Right? Because we understand that generally we're not treated the same way, we're not suspected the same way, we're not criminalized the same way. I know this from personal experience. I don't need to read the data. Though the data is instructive, my own personal life story is evidence of how differently we are treated, and therefore how differently we tend to see law enforcement. I can tell you about this story now because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, and they can't touch me anymore, so here it goes. 30 years ago, this April, I guess it was, I was in college at Tulane University in New Orleans. I was coming back from a debate tournament that was being held in San Antonio at the time. In the car with me was my debate partner, another 2-person debate team, and the coach. And as we are heading back from San Antonio to New Orleans, Louisiana, in the rental car that we had procured, as I was driving through a place called Gonzales, Texas, was going about 13 miles an hour over the speed limit. I get pulled over by that cop. Right? And as I pull over to the side of the road, I'm nervous. Now, I'm nervous, number one, because, nobody likes to get stopped by the cops. Even white people don't enjoy the experience, We don't have reason to fear it quite the same way, but it's not fun for us. It's not like we sign up for that, right? So on the one hand, I don't like being stopped by a cop, but the real reason I'm nervous is I know what's in the car. And by what's in the car, I don't mean debate evidence. I mean what is in the briefcase of that coach at that time, which just so happened to be 2.5 ounces of weed, an 8 ball of cocaine, 8 hits of acid, about 12 sheets of ecstasy. For those of you not schooled in the narcotic arts, let it suffice to say that is way more than you can use for personal consumption. So if you get popped with that kind of stuff in your briefcase, you're going to go down not for simple possession, you're going to go down with possession with intent to distribute, which in the state of Texas, both then and now, will send you away for a very, very long time. So the cop comes to the window, knocks on the window. I'm nervous, I'm already sweating, right? Because again, I'm worried that they might search the car. I roll the window down, he asks for ID, I'm looking for it, I can't find it anywhere. Felt like I was there for 3 weeks, it was probably just 30 or 45 seconds, right? He says, you want to come back into the cruiser and look for it there, the light's better. I didn't really want to do this, but I didn't know that I had much choice, so I said, sure, and my voice cracked like I was 13, because again, I was nervous. So I go back to the cruiser, I sit there, I'm flipping through looking for my license so I can show it to him. I cannot find it. Now, all of a sudden, I turn that little plastic thing and it shows my fake ID, which is really helpful in moments like that. He says, isn't that it? I'm like, no, I don't know what in the hell that is. That is some kind of craft project. No idea what the hell that is. That's not it. He goes, are you sure? He starts to reach for it. Just as he starts to reach for it, thank God I find my reel when I pull it out. I say, here it is. He goes, is that the one you want to go with? I said, yeah, that's the one. Tennessee right there. That's where I'm from. Tennessee. That's it. Right? And he writes me a $75 ticket and he sends me on my way. If anyone thinks that that would have played out the same way had I been black or brown, acting as nervous as I was acting, having a very obvious fake ID that he knew was a fake ID, but ultimately did not confiscate. If anybody thinks that would have gone down the same way if I'd been black or brown, you're just not paying attention. And I don't mean to this speech, I mean like to life in general in this country right now or 30 years ago. So that's why for us, the fear is seemingly so often irrational because our experiences don't comport with the thing that makes black and brown folks logically afraid. So part of our job individually, not just like professionally, but just individually as people in this country and on this planet, is to understand other people's psychology as it plays out for them, even when it doesn't seem to make sense for us. Right? Because even though we tend to default to what we consider the norm in various scientific studies and social science research, the norm is not the same for everybody. What is normal for this group over here in terms of their experiences is totally abnormal for this group over here. And if I'm not willing from this side to understand what's going on in the bodies and the minds of the people on this side, then I can't be involved in the creation of justice. What are some of the other effects? Well, in addition to heightened anxiety, the psychological effect of being over-policed and being presumed guilty and being the recipient of so much injustice, whether it is at the hands of law enforcement or just in general, will also create a certain degree of fatalism and internalization of that negativity. Right? Because if I'm somebody who's constantly being told that I am lesser than, constantly being told that I am bad, constantly being told that my entire neighborhood is bad, then what are the odds that I'm going to internalize those ideals myself? I always have this conversation with teachers because I meet a lot of really, I think, well-intended teachers in this country teaching in mostly schools of color. I meet an awful lot of teachers who I think are well-intended, but they'll say things like, when they're trying to inspire their students to stay in school, right, and then go to college and get a good education, they'll say things like, you need to get a good education because that's your ticket out of here. That's the way you're going to escape. That's the way you're going to get out. Right? And I'm sure they mean well, right? Because what they're saying is you can go out and do great things, but do you understand, like when you say to a child, this is the way that you can get out of where you're from, what that child hears is that everything I'm from and everything I know and everybody that's ever loved and cared for me is broken and not good enough. And my goal should be to abandon them. My goal should be able to get some type of certification that says I'm better than them and that I have the right to leave them behind and not concern myself with their liberation. So we don't necessarily mean to give that message, but even well-intended educators who were just trying in their mind to do right by the kids in their classroom end up conveying that kind of message of systemic incapacity, let's say, in a neighborhood. What are the odds that a child is going to internalize that? I would say that that's pretty good odds. And I say that again, not as a clinician, but I see enough heads nodding in the room to know that I'm probably onto something relatively logical when I say that. And it actually can play out even in the way that families within that community interact with their kids. If you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend that you read Stacey Patton's book. Stacey's a good friend and amazing academic. She's a scholar at Morgan State University in Baltimore in the journalism department. And she has written extensively on race. African-American woman has written a lot about race in general, but specifically about the way in which the strictures and norms of white supremacy, including the strictures and norms and the way that law enforcement and people in authority have abused black bodies, the way that that's affected even the way that some black parents end up parenting because of an internalization of that oppression that is being systematized and then laid upon those black bodies. So her book, Spare the Kids, is an examination of corporal punishment, specifically in the black community. Now, she's very clear, it's not just a black phenomena. That's a myth, the idea that white folks are all giving their kids timeouts and, black folks are all whooping their kids is not true. Plenty of black folks don't, and plenty of white folks do, so let's be clear on that. There's also a regional component. It's much more common in the South, and black folks are disproportionately in the South. It's also a religiously affiliated component. So she's very clear in general, and as a black woman in particular. She's not trying to say this is a black thing, but what she says, for instance, she goes through the whole history of corporal punishment. She goes through the ways that it gets rationalized in spite of the very clear research that it's damaging. The unambiguous research, unanimous research that it's damaging, without any research to suggest it isn't, other than somebody saying, I got whooped and I turned out okay, which is not evidence. Which is not evidence. And actually, when people say that, I'm like, did you? Because I don't know that that's even true. But what Dr. Patton does, what Stacy does in her book that's so brilliant is she says, where does that, she says on the one hand, and this is really important for us to understand, I think particularly for white clinicians to understand if you're working with patients, for instance, where this is an issue, the use of physical restraint and or spanking. And I'm not talking about overt, over-the-top violence, but just the kind of stuff that we always let go and tend to think is just maybe normal. She is very clear about saying that the rationales that people will use, let's say that black parents will use, oftentimes are about what? If I don't do this to you, white folks will, and particularly the cops, right? If I don't beat this out of you, the police will beat this out of you, or worse, they'll kill you. And what she tries to explain, she says, see, that's not an African value system. We didn't bring that from Africa. The idea that we would beat children, we didn't do that. Right? That was something we learned on the plantation. That was something that we learned under white supremacy because that is what they would do to us. She says, actually spanking your children is the whitest thing that you could do. Her words, not mine, though I agree with them based on her research, and it's pretty obvious that she's onto something. But understand, that's an internalization of oppression. Right? That's saying that because the system does this, I gotta do it first. That's not a healthy psychological adaptation to oppression, but it's perfectly predictable. It makes perfect sense. It's not surprising, but if you're working with patients where that's an issue, if you don't understand that history, right? If you don't understand the root of where that comes from, it becomes very easy to just judge the behavior, doesn't it? And to think of it as some type of a pathological behavior that's completely unhealthy, that's the result of, something else going on, when in fact it might very well be the internalization of racial oppression that has been mounting and developing for centuries. That creates a whole different pathway for a therapeutic relationship, I would imagine, a whole different set of conversations that one can have, but only if you know that history, and only if you understand those kinds of dynamics that take place with marginalized peoples. And I would guess if you studied marginalized communities in any country, not just in the United States and certainly not just black folks, you would see some of the same stuff. Internalized oppression is a long-standing and studied phenomenon. Stacy Patton talks about it, Joy DeGruy talks about it. I would recommend anyone who is attempting to provide any type of psychological services and or medical services and or educational services or any kind of service to communities of color, read Stacy Patton's work, Joy DeGru's work, people who have been working on this kind of thing for a very long time. And then the next issue, though, that's also important to understand is the way that this over-policing, the way that this negrophobia, again, Jody David Armour's word, the way that it affects the psychology, not of people of color, but of the dominant group. Because this over-policing doesn't just have a psychological effect on the victim and the target, it also has a residual psychological effect on the folks not being targeted. And we need to talk about that. We usually miss this piece because we think of racism and other forms of oppression as only having health consequences for the people who were targeted. Now, clearly, that's the first order of business, right? The ones who were the targets of oppression are the ones that we do need to focus on, and the ones whose psychological and or physical health consequences that come from that need to be our primary concern. But if we ignore the psychological and even physical health effects on the dominant group of racism, racist thinking, and racist institutional structures, we miss a big piece of the picture, and we also miss an opportunity to create a sense of shared destiny between white folks and people of color. Because if I don't know that this thing is also hurting me, right, then it becomes very easy for me to look at racism as this abstract thing. And that's even if I'm a really caring, compassionate person, right? I could be somebody who's horrified by the injustices of police misconduct in black communities. Or I could be horrified by the inequalities in wealth. Right now, median white household wealth between 12 and 15 times that of African American wealth. Even white families headed by high school dropouts have more wealth on average than black families headed by college grads, right? Because of a history of unequal opportunity. I can be horrified by that. I can be somebody who says, gosh, that's terrible, we ought to do something about it. But in terms of really joining the movement or struggle to actually do something, rather than just say somebody ought to do something, to actually join the struggle to make that change, I need to understand that I've got some skin in the game, that it affects me. Now, it'd be great if white folks would just fight white supremacy because it's the right thing to do. But if you're waiting for that to happen, see, black and brown folks stopped waiting for that to happen a real damn long time ago. Black and brown folks not sitting around waiting for white folks to become saints and angels when it comes to this issue. Just like most women not sitting around thinking one of these days men will realize that misogyny is inherently evil and they will stamp it out all on their own, right? unless men understand that misogyny actually damages us by setting up certain expectations about what real manhood is, that most of us can't actually live up to, right? Unless we understand that we're also harmed by it, then we miss an opportunity to create a sense of shared damage and shared destiny. Same thing with race. So how does it happen with racism? Well, first of all, let's just think about the way that the fear of black folks in particular and brown folks and the criminalization of them is now affecting the health, both the psychological and the physical health of millions of white people in this country. Do we think it's a coincidence that we fought a war on drugs for decades in which we didn't believe in rehabilitation, we didn't believe in treatment, we didn't believe in drug education, we just locked people away? Do we believe there's a coincidence between that, which was clearly a racialized phenomena on the one hand, and the fact that right now we don't have enough services for white folks who are dying from opioid overdoses in rural and small town America? Do we actually think that there's no clear connection between those things? I mean, if you treat the issue of drug addiction like a criminal problem rather than a health problem, then you don't create the services, you don't create the structures, you don't create the institutions, the policies, the practices, and the procedures to deal with it as a health problem, and then you just shake it up and wait 20 years and now white folks dying. Right? Do we not think there's a relationship between the core mythology of America and the pain that millions of white folks feel right now that they don't know how to cope with? What do I mean by that? Two pieces to that, right? The core mythology of America. What is it? It's the thing that every one of us in here has been taught. If not by our parents, by teachers. If not by teachers, by preachers. If not preachers, by politicians. If not politicians, just in the air we breathe. It's this idea that in America, you can be anything if you're just willing to work hard, right? Wherever you end up is all about you. Anybody can make it if they're just willing to work hard and make the right choices. But if I grow up believing that, let's say first of all, if I grow up believing that and then I look around and I see massive inequality, right? Let's take it out of the race for a minute issue and just look at class. I see rich folks here and poor and working class people here. Classism and class inequality becomes rational to me. Because I look at that and then I take the propaganda of the country, the notion of rugged individualism, which is like Genesis 1:1 of the Bible of Americanism, right? And I put those things together, and now I'm saying, well, these rich folks, they must be there because they're just better. They're just smarter. They're just more moral. And these folks who are poor, even those poor white folks, they're just lesser because they don't want it as bad. They didn't try as hard. They made bad decisions. And then I look around and I see racial inequity. I see white folks disproportionately up here, people of color disproportionately down here. And then I put that together with what I was told, wherever you end up is all about you, and I decide white folks must be superior and black and brown folks inferior. I look at gender inequity. I see men disproportionately here, women disproportionately here. I put two and two together with the mentality that says wherever you end up is all about you, and I decide that men must be smarter or harder working, or that women just aren't as committed as a value to their careers or whatever, to rationalize the inequality. Now here's the problem with this. Not only does that hurt the people on the bottom, because then we keep those structures in place, but what happens if I'm one of those white guys who all of my life was told, number one, wherever you end up is all about you. You can make it, you can do anything if you're just willing to work hard. And then I put that together with the fact that I got laid off a year ago and I can't find work. And I'm living in a small town where the plants are closing because the economy has gone global and the coal mines are closing because coal is not an efficient way to create energy. It's not the environmentalists who are to blame for that. It's just not profitable, and so they're closing down the mines. But you told me all of my life that as long as I was willing to work hard, there would always be work for me. Right? Even white working class people could trust in that notion of horizontal mobility. Maybe not vertical, but horizontal, meaning what? My granddad worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I'm gonna work in the mine, I'm gonna get my kid a job with the union, he's gonna work in the mine, or the assembly line, or whatever. Now, black and brown folks could never take that for granted. Right? Black and brown folks didn't grow up thinking, as long as I have a strong back and am willing to work, I'm sure they'll always find a place for me. Right? People of color know better than that. But white folks have had just enough connection to the myth of meritocracy, just enough ability to believe in it that we took it for granted as true, and now it's blowing up even on millions of us. And we aren't prepared for it, which is why that study that came out from Princeton a few years ago, from the two economists there, both award-winning economists, that looked at the upsurge in deaths, the upsurge in mortality rates, but specifically in one group that eclipsed all the others. Right? What was it? It was white, middle-aged, non-college educated folks, white working class folks, middle-aged, right, without a college degree, saw a huge spike, 500,000 excess deaths over a 14-year period relative to what otherwise would have been expected, given the trends before that started. And those deaths were driven mostly by three things: opioid overdoses, cirrhosis of the liver, which of course is brought on disproportionately by heavy drinking, and suicide. Now, why would these working class white folks, middle-aged, non-college educated, be increasingly and far more in far greater numbers than people of color who are suffering more in absolute terms on any economic indicator? Poverty, unemployment, wealth, all of those things. Black and brown folks still worse off than those white folks, but not as likely to end their lives in one of these three ways that the researchers call deaths of despair. Why is it that these white folks are having a uniquely difficult time coping with despair? The only logical answer that I can come up with, and I've thought about it for more than a minute, is that it's precisely because white folks were told this will never happen to you. This will not be your lot. In other words, a system of inequality not only lowers the expectations for the people on the bottom of the hierarchy, it raises the expectations so dramatically for the people on the top of the hierarchy that when things go sideways for us, we do not have the resilience, we do not have the coping skills, we do not have the strategies with which to deal with any of that. And when I then am struggling to find work, to pay for my kids' education, to pay for health care, to pay my mortgage, I've now got two options. Neither one of them are healthy, and neither one of them are going to help me. I can turn to opiates, literal opiates, to try to numb my pain, because that's what an opioid is. An opioid doesn't solve your problem, right? It just blocks the pain receptors. I mean, if you crush a disc in your back, right, they can give you opiates to deal with the pain. It's not going to fix the disc. You're going to need surgery. If you have cancer, they can give you opiates to numb the pain. It's not going to fix the cancer. You're going to have other things done in order to possibly become cancer-free. So I can do that. It's not going to solve my problem. Or I can blame others and I can look for a political opiate to solve my problem. And I think it doesn't take a huge leap of faith to suggest that the current president of the United States, in terms of his rhetoric, has served as a walking, talking, breathing human opioid for millions of white folks whose problems he has not solved, but which he has promised to solve by way of blaming things that aren't actually to blame. And so then you have these folks who are in real pain, and I am empathetic about that pain. I'm not trying to mock it. That's real. What I'm upset about is the diagnosis that we've been given for that. Yeah, and I say this as a confirmed hypochondriac, y'all. I mean, I am a professional hypochondriac. I'm not an amateur like some of you. I know some of you, think that when you have a pain, something's wrong. No, I'm a pro. I need to get paid for my level of hypochondria, right? Because I have an intimate relationship with Dr. Google, and I just keep turning to him, even though he never knows what he's talking about. I'll get on Dr. Google, and I'll get on some chat board that tells me that the pain I have is definitely going to lead me to die in the next 7 days, and the person on the chat board knows this because they died last month from the same thing. And I'm actually just have enough hypochondria to believe them, even though they posted that shit like 10 minutes before, so they clearly did not actually die, but I am just that person, right? A couple years back, I had a chest pain, and it was so bad. But see, professional hypochondriacs never say anything to their partner, right? So I'm laying right next to my wife for 3 days with this pain, but I'm not saying anything, right? Because amateur hypochondriac will run to the hospital at the first sign of problems. The professional will be like, no, it's over, there's no point. So I'm laying there with chest pain, not telling my wife. Finally, on the 4th day, I'm like, I think something's wrong. She's like, what's the matter? I said, I don't know, I'm having chest pains. She's like, well, maybe you should go to the doctor. I'm like, yeah, I think it's past the doctor phase. I need to go to the ER. Which is now I need to go to the ER voice is this thing that I'm doing right here. And so I go, and $6,000 later, toward my still not met deductible, I find out that I pulled a muscle. Like I said, professional hypochondriac. So here's the good thing about my wife, though, and the reason I'm telling you this story. God love her, she's a wonderful person, very compassionate. When I told her I was in pain, she didn't say, no, you're not. It's all in your head. She didn't say that. She was very compassionate, about the fact that I was having pain. She didn't question the pain was real, but she was trying to get me to not diagnose myself or believe the bullshit that I could find online. She was saying, the pain is real, but your diagnosis is nonsense. Go consult with an expert, right? And that's the same thing with this economic pain that people are in. It's important that we're compassionate to people who are hurting. Right? And millions of people are, including millions of white men who never expected that this level of insecurity would affect them, who never expected that when the recession hit, double-digit unemployment for black and brown folks wasn't new. It was just like a more extreme version of Tuesday, right? But for an awful lot of white communities, double-digit unemployment, we hadn't seen that since the Depression. 3 generations of white folks have come and gone without seeing that level of insecurity. I know that's got to scare people. But what does it really mean, and what should it scare us to do? It should scare us to embrace solidarity. Because see, if we had taken care of business on the front end, when that stuff was confronting black and brown folks, if we had taken care of business on the front end with not a war on drugs, but treating drug issues, whether it was the opioid crisis of the 70s or the crack epidemic of the 80s as a health issue and not a lock them up and throw away the key issue, maybe we'd be able to help those millions of white folks who are in pain right now. Because this is doing damage to them, you see? Fighting racism and racial inequality, both at the personal, individual level, at the level of your own practice as clinicians and also as citizens of this country who go and vote for candidates. That is not just the business of altruism. It's not trying to help other people. It's not trying to fix other people. It's not simply something we do for them. Solidarity is something we got to do for all of us. Thank you all so much for being here.